Snow remembers everything, or so I was told when I was young, and that winter, when the world seemed carved from white silence and old sins, Snow remembered her first. Iona Grey Elk, 24 years old, walked into that remembered winter with her head lowered and her breath shaking, a native woman already judged before she had spoken a single word, and the town watched her as if she were something that had drifted in with the storm and refused to melt, while the wind whispered that nothing arriving in such weather ever did so by accident. She had no parents to speak for her, no name spoken kindly by anyone with power, only the thin memory of hands that once braided her hair before sickness took them away, and an uncle whose love ended where hunger began. He sold her the way men sell horses when winter grows cruel, and though he could not meet her eyes when he signed the paper, the ink dried all the same, leaving her standing in the snow with nothing but a shawl and the weight of a future decided by others, while the town leaned closer to see what punishment looked like when it wore a woman's face. Silas Crow, 55 years old, owner of the largest ranch for miles, stood wrapped in wool and authority, his breath sharp with the cold and with habit, and he announced that Iona would be given to Cole Blackwood as discipline, for her silence, for her refusal to smile, for being a reminder that not all lives bent easily. The words struck the air like a gavel, and somewhere behind him laughter flickered, because punishment was easier to swallow when it did not belong to you, and the snow seemed to wait for the man who had just been named. Cole Blackwood, 30 years old, stepped forward from the edge of the gathering like a shadow detaching itself from a wall, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by storms and rumors alike, known in town as the feared cowboy who spoke little and rode alone. His eyes, dark and steady, flicked once to Iona, not with hunger or triumph, but with something quieter, something almost wary, and that single glance unsettled her more than cruelty would have, because fear she understood, but restraint left her unsure where she stood, and the snow deepened around their boots as if urging them closer whether they wished it or not. Days that followed moved slowly, each one groaning beneath the burden of cold and unspoken cruelty, and Iona learned the rhythm of the ranch the way wounded animals learn the shape of their cages, by watching, by listening, by never daring to ask. Questions invited notice, and notice had always been the sharpest blade, so she folded herself into silence and worked until her hands cracked and bled beneath the winter air, believing that endurance was the only language the world would allow her to speak. In town she walked with her gaze fixed on the snow, counting her steps so she would not hear the laughter, yet it brushed past her all the same, cold and careless as the wind that cut through her shawl. Children mocked the way she moved, their small voices bright with borrowed cruelty, while their mothers turned away, pretending not to see as if blindness could wash their hands clean, and with every step Iona felt herself growing smaller, as though the earth itself were asking her to disappear. And still, through it all, Cole never raised his voice, never lifted a hand, never claimed what had been handed to him like a debt to be collected. Instead, he left her space, quiet, deliberate space, where she had expected walls, commands, and bruises, and that gentleness unsettled her more deeply than violence ever could. She did not know how to live inside kindness that asked for nothing, and each night, as the fire burned low and the snow pressed against the windows, she lay awake wondering which would break her first, the town's open judgment or the terrifying possibility that she might finally be safe. At night, when the fire burned low and the world outside leaned in with its white, listening hush, Iona began to notice the quiet mercies Cole left behind as if he hoped they would be discovered rather than acknowledged, a blanket folded near her bed, not placed too close as though he feared startling her, her boots drawn gently toward the hearth so the leather would soften and warm by morning, a plate set aside for her even on nights when the cupboards were thin and hunger lingered like a second cold. Each gesture was small enough to be denied, yet together they formed a tenderness that wrapped around her more surely than any spoken vow. He never explained himself, never asked for recognition, and she never thanked him aloud, because gratitude had always been a fragile thing in her life, something that invited loss the moment it was named. To speak it felt like tempting fate, like admitting she needed what might still be taken away. Yet despite her caution, something within her began to loosen, slowly, almost painfully, as if a knot she had carried for years was being undone one careful thread at a time. And as the snow continued to fall outside, soft and unending, she found herself wondering, with a hope that frightened her more than despair ever had, whether the world might finally be making room for her to stay. Town visits were worse, because silence there was mistaken for guilt, and the sheriff, Thomas Hale, with his polished badge and practiced frown, allowed the mockery to continue under the banner of order. Once, when a man's words grew sharp enough to draw blood without touching skin, Cole stepped between them, not reaching for his gun, not raising his voice, only standing still until the insults thinned and fell away like ash. The sheriff warned him to remember his place, and Cole nodded as if obedience were easier than justice, but Ayanna saw the tightness in his jaw and wondered how long such stillness could last. It ended on a morning when the sky hung low and the snow reflected every face like a pale mirror, and laughter turned openly cruel, accusing Ayanna of being less than human, less than worthy of the ground she stood on. Cole moved before she could shrink away, placing himself beside her with a finality that stilled even the wind, and when he spoke it was not loud, but it carried, each word placed with care, as if he were building something fragile in front of witnesses who had never learned to look gently. "She is special," he said, his voice steady despite the cold, "and she is important, and you will not speak of her as if she were nothing." Silence spread outward, thick and stunned, and even the sheriff faltered, because no one had expected the feared cowboy to claim value instead of dominance, to defend without demanding ownership. Ayanna felt something break open in her chest, not loudly, but with the ache of long-held breath finally released, and she wondered what would be taken from them now that such words had been spoken aloud. The storm that evening came fast, pinning them indoors with walls of snow, and in the quiet that followed Cole sat across from her by the fire, his hat resting on his knee as if he had laid aside more than just leather. He did not rush his words, and when he finally spoke, he asked instead of told, his voice low and unsure as he offered her a life chosen together rather than endured alone. There was no ring yet, no audience, only the soft crackle of flame and the sound of her own heart as she nodded, tears tracing paths down her cheeks that the firelight turned to gold, while the night pressed close, waiting to see what they would become. Their marriage came wrapped in snow, a proper ceremony despite the whispers, with vows spoken slowly as if each one were being set into stone. Cole promised protection without possession, patience without condition, and Ayanna promised resilience shared rather than borne alone, and when they exchanged rings the snow fell harder, blanketing the ground as though the world itself wished to make the moment clean. The town watched, uncertain whether to scoff or stand silent, and the silence won, if only for that day. Life after did not soften all at once, because judgment, like winter, does not retreat simply because it is asked to. The town still watched, still whispered, still weighed her worth in glances that lingered too long, yet within that cold scrutiny a fragile warmth began to grow between them, nurtured not by grand declarations but by moments so small they might have been missed by anyone not starving for gentleness. They shared cups of coffee at dawn, steam curling between their faces as their shoulders brushed, and sometimes their gloved hands met by accident, then stayed, neither of them pulling away, as if both were silently agreeing that some things were worth the risk. Laughter found them unexpectedly, shy at first, like water testing cracked ice, and when it came it startled Ayanna enough to make her press a hand to her mouth, afraid the sound might break. Cole would look at her then, really look, his eyes softening as though he were memorizing the shape of her joy, and in those moments the world narrowed to the space between them, warm and breathless, almost safe. It might have been enough, might have remained a quiet, unfinished happiness, if fate had not reached in with its familiar cruelty. Illness came for Silas Crow without warning, swift and merciless, and the man who had once ruled the land with certainty was reduced to a trembling figure beneath heavy blankets, his breath shallow, his skin drained of color. The winter that had taught Ayanna endurance now seemed to circle back with purpose, reminding her that mercy, like love, is often tested at the moment it feels most precious, and she stood at that edge, wondering what part of herself she would be asked to give next. Iana recognized the signs immediately, knowledge passed down through hands that had healed long before towns were built, and though no one asked her, she prepared the herbs all the same, crushing and boiling them with careful attention, her breath fogging the air as if her ancestors leaned close. She gave the medicine to Cole, who carried it without question to the man who had once decided her fate so carelessly, and watched as pride gave way to need, and need to shame. When Silas recovered, strength returning like thawed earth, he called them before the town, his wife standing beside him with eyes lowered, and he spoke an apology that cracked as it left his mouth. The sheriff added his own, the words awkward but sincere, and Iana accepted them without ceremony, because forgiveness, she had learned, was not a performance but a release. The town shifted then, something unspoken loosening as people saw not what they had been taught to fear, but what they had nearly lost. The celebration Silas arranged turned the snow-covered yard into a world reborn, lantern lights spilling across the white ground like scattered stars while music drifted warmly through the cold air. For the first time, Iana danced without shrinking, her steps unguarded, her face lifted, and Cole's hands rested at her waist with a tenderness that anchored her, steady and sure. As they moved together, the distance she had always felt between herself and the world seemed to close, and the laughter rising around them no longer cut or mocked, but wrapped her in a sound she had once believed was not meant for her. Cole drew her closer then, his forehead brushing hers as if he were asking permission without words, and when he kissed her it was slow and reverent, a promise spoken in breath and warmth rather than sound. The cheer that followed washed over them like a blessing, but it faded quickly, leaving only the quiet truth of their closeness, her heart racing beneath his palm. Snow drifted down around them in soft, unhurried flakes, settling into her hair and his coat, and for a single perfect moment it felt as though the world itself had paused, satisfied at last, to watch love claim its place. They returned home long after the music had faded, walking side by side through the quiet snow, their steps falling into the same gentle rhythm, as if they had always belonged that way. The world felt smaller then, softer, reduced to the sound of their breathing, the brush of his sleeve against her coat, and the promise of warmth waiting behind a door that no longer felt like shelter alone, but like belonging. Cole reached for her hand without thinking, and she laced her fingers through his, surprised not by the touch, but by how naturally it fit, as though her hand had been searching for his all along. In the years that followed, they grew not in grand leaps, but in patient, intimate moments, shared mornings wrapped in quilts, quiet conversations by lamplight, kisses pressed to tired hands after long days. The town's approval came slowly, if it came at all, but it no longer mattered, because they had learned to truly see one another. Her strength shaped by survival, his gentleness forged through restraint, both made whole in the space they created together. That seeing, honest and unwavering, carried them through every storm, proving stronger than rumor, stronger than winter, stronger even than fear. And if there is a lesson to be gathered from their story, it is not shouted, but whispered like snow against a windowpane. Dignity is not something the world bestows when it finally agrees to be kind, and love is never born of ownership or force. It grows in quiet places, in shared silences and chosen tenderness, beneath falling snow where time slows just enough for wounded hearts to remember who they were always meant to be, and who they can become when someone finally chooses to love them gently.